Uh, Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Futures seminar series. My name is Lee Roberts. I'm one of the organizers of the series. I'd like to start by acknowledging that, at least for those of us in the room, we're meeting today on the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal people that may be joining us today. I'm going to turn over to Dr. Chris Martin to introduce our speaker in a minute, but first a little bit of housekeeping. Just a reminder, especially for people joining us online, to please mute your microphone during the presentation, and then if you'd like to, at the end, we'll have a time for Q&A. You're welcome to turn on your microphone then to ask a question and your camera. But you can also put a question into the chat. Richard in the back, you can't see him, but the other organizer of the series will be monitoring the chat. So if you'd like to put in a question at any time, then you can ask that question. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Chris Martin to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Lee. Welcome everyone here and online. I'm doing this because I happen to be wearing a suit today. So we've got tasked with welcoming our speaker, but it's also my great pleasure to introduce our speaker because we're talking with Hazel Easthope, the Deputy Director of the Centre, and we're talking on a very important subject today: delivering sustainable apartment housing. There's demand from residents for more sustainable apartments in Australia, but that's not necessarily what's getting built. And so we're going to hear a presentation from Hazel today about the development process and explaining why we haven't seen a mainstream supply of sustainable apartments and the sort of shifts that we need to change our present situation. So it's a presentation drawing on recent research by UNSW and RMIT colleagues, funded by Huri. That was undertaken by Hazel, Jasmine Palmer, Andrea Sharam, Megan Nethercutt, Gloria Pignata, and Laura Cromler. And you can find a copy of that on the Huri's website. But I'll introduce Hazel in particular. Hazel's the Deputy Director of City Futures Research Centre. She's a sociologist, a geographer, and her special area is urban studies and housing, and in particular, apartment buildings, private apartment buildings, and the lived experience of residents. So her interests in this area span property title and ownership structures, estate governance and management, urban renewal and housing redevelopment, and increasingly building retrofits and upgrades. And she does a lot of consultation with government, community sector, and peak organisations. And it's, she's the expert in this area as well. I'll hand over to you and make you very welcome.
Thanks very much, Chris. So it is my great pleasure to be here today to tell you about this report that myself and the other authors are quite proud of, to I guess answer some questions that you may have had about why are things the way they are when it comes to apartment development. So first, the team, it really was a dream team. Myself, Jasmine, Andrea, Megan, Gloria, and Laura. We have complementary skills across planning, architecture, building design, and finance, as well as interest in the strata sector in particular. The project was funded by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, and the final report was published in June. I'm going to speak today about the final report findings. When I was preparing this presentation, I was going over the final report and I was like, oh my goodness, this is huge. How am I ever going to cover this in a presentation? I must select a part of it to cover. And then I said, no, I'm going to cover it all. So strap in. I'm going to cover it all. I'm going to give you a framework to describe what we did, what we found, how we made sense of it. But I expect that hopefully you'll get excited by it and you'll go and look at the report and begin to understand everything that we found. So the aim for the research is there on the bottom of the slide, to identify how a transition towards mainstream supply of new and retrofitted apartments that are sustainable can be achieved in Australia. Just a small aim on this thinking. So if we're trying to develop sustainable apartments, what do we mean? This was the definition that we used for what we mean by sustainable apartments. Okay, so this report was part of a broader research package. Ahuri has projects which they call inquiry projects, which are broad areas of research that have sub-projects underneath them. This was a sub-project under a broader inquiry, which was focused on informing a strategy for circular economy housing in Australia, which was led by Professor Ralph Horn. And you can see the other projects there, which were delivered alongside of it, and all of those are now published and available on the Ahuri website. Just because I'm looking at my iPad and I'm seeing a few faces, those of you who are online, would you mind just turning your video off for the presentation and then turn it on again when we start? Thanks. Okay, so what did we do and who did we speak with? We made a decision early on that we wanted to speak, given that our focus was on why are these things being delivered in the way they're being delivered, we wanted to speak to the people who are involved in delivering them. So we didn't speak with residents and owners in apartment buildings. We did refer to other researchers who had done that, and I'll summarise some of that work. We decided to speak with people who are actually involved in delivering apartment buildings, and this is a list of the types of people that we spoke with, and the organisations that those people work for are listed at the front of the report. If you're interested, you could go and see which organisations participated. So we did 33 interviews, we summarised what we found, and we took that to 3 subsequent workshops with 27 participants, most of whom were the original from the original 33 interviewees. So I said I'm going to cover it all, and I am. These are the things that the abstract said it would cover, and I've broken the presentation into 3 parts. So part 1 is making the case there is demand for more sustainable apartments, but what gets built is not necessarily what people want. Part 2 is a justification for why we focused on apartments. So why aren't we talking about sustainable housing? Why are we talking about sustainable apartments in particular? Why does that matter? Part 3 is answering the question, why don't we have a mainstream supply of sustainable apartments? And given that, what needs to change? So part 1, there is a demand, but what gets built is not necessarily what people want. So first of all, who lives in apartments? Who are the residents? I've put up this slide. This is reference to some work that my colleague Bill Randolph, who's in the room, hi Bill, did with other colleagues of ours, Andy Tice and Alistair Sisson, across different censuses, which was breaking down resident profiles for apartment residents across Sydney and Melbourne. And they came up with 5 main profiles, which I've listed here. I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but I do encourage you to go and have a look at the very cool CityViz story on the City Futures website that talks through this. The main point of this slide is to say, who lives in apartments? The answer is all kinds of people. Lots of different kinds of people. There are lots of different apartment submarkets. Apartments house wealthy downsizers. They house families on low to moderate incomes, and they house all sorts of other people across our cities. Australia is quite interesting internationally in that we don't have very much social housing, but we also don't have a very developed rental housing system, which means that almost all private renters in apartments are living in strata titled apartments as well, and I'll come to why that matters shortly. So what do residents experience? This is what the literature tells us, that sustainability behaviours are limited by buildings. So residents in apartments are limited in what they can do. For example, the ability to cross-ventilate in buildings that don't have natural cross-ventilation, the ability to recycle organic waste in buildings that have shared bin rooms, etc. The capacity for sustainable living in apartment buildings also varies by tenure, and this paper, I'll have the references at the end of the presentation. This paper by Alexa Gower is super fascinating. I don't know if Alexa's online, but if she is, maybe we can ask her about it. But what she found was that even within individual apartment buildings, renters tend to be in the units that perform worst in terms of things like solar access and cross ventilation. So even within a building, renters are doing worse in terms of sustainability infrastructure in their units. We also know that apartment residents are less likely to experience fuel poverty overall, which is good, but that energy-related poverty is concentrated amongst lower income renter households. And we know that there's a large number of lower income renter households in private apartments in Australia. Okay. So there's lots of support in the literature for sustainable apartment buildings in all parts of the market. That includes for renters and for owner occupiers from low cost to high end markets. There is evidence in Australia of demand. And much of the blame for unsustainable housing is placed on owners and occupiers. We sometimes hear industry arguments that they build what people want, but people can't access what they want because of industry resistance to change and limited government action. So these are findings from a report on the broader housing system that's referenced there. And for the rest of the presentation, you're going to see some little orange boxes on the right-hand side. And in those orange boxes, I've pulled interview quotes from the report that kind of support the points that I'm making. So I'm also going to use the orange boxes as a chance to have a sip of water and breathe. So please read them and I'll move on. Okay. Another thing that was raised quite a lot with the people that we spoke with, and I've called this when owners are not residents. In private apartments in Australia, there are more renters than there are owner occupiers. And many people that we spoke with thought that investor owners were less likely to be concerned with sustainable building performance than owner occupiers were. Now, whether that's true or whether that's a speculation, it's still a concern. If there is an assumption out there that the majority of purchasers are not interested in sustainability, then that's a concern. Another thing that was quite interesting at the time that we were doing these interviews, the market was changing and we were seeing a move in the apartment market away from investors and towards owner occupiers. And that was actually one of the reasons why this issue kept coming up and something that was being discussed quite a bit and is discussed here. Okay, so what actually gets built? A very small proportion of apartment building projects contain sustainability features that go beyond the minimum standards. So one of the things that we did in the report was we analysed a property data set, the Cordell Connect property data set, which has written descriptions of building works that have been occurring. We looked at it across Sydney and Melbourne. And we tried to identify apartment projects that exceeded minimum standards through an analysis of those descriptions. And through that, we found very few within that sample that exceeded the minimum. So it was 3% of the sample in Sydney and 6% in Melbourne. And again, I won't go into the method of that, but it is in the report if you're interested in looking at it. So part two, why apartments? I've kind of hinted a little bit at that in part one, but I'm going to get into the nitty gritty. I really love this image. There's a source at the bottom. I like to say to people, apartments are not houses stacked on top of each other. Because often in discussion and policy, that's how they're treated, but they're not. No, I'll tease that out a bit. So this is table 7 from the report. It's a screenshot. And in the report, we say that there are 3 things that make apartment development different and worthy of separate examination. One is that most private apartments in Australia are delivered through speculative strata title development. The second is that they're physically independent properties. All apartment buildings have physically independent properties. They rely on each other to stand up. And the third is that where they're strata titled, they're jointly owned. I'm going to use this table to help step you through the report. So we'll keep coming back to it and we'll move from left to right in the table. So those 3 things have implications as it relates to the circular economy, and I'll talk you through those now. Circular economy principles. So the first one, speculative strata development. What is the relevance of that to circular economy principles? I'll tell you the relevance and then I'll explain it. So the relevance is there's a disconnect between production and consumption, and the product is not optimized. So to explain what that means, this image on the right is an image I had a cartoonist create for me for another publication. I think it's kind of cool. It basically shows you how strata works. When you buy into strata, you buy an individual unit, and you also buy into a joint share of the building, land and other assets, which is called common property. And that's managed through an owners association with an executive committee, a strata committee and a manager, et cetera, et cetera. But what that means is that when developers are developing new apartment buildings, they're not developing them for a single client. They're developing them for a whole bunch of owners. So I'm just going to point at the screen. None of you online will see this, but they're developing a whole bunch of owners, each of whom is going to own an individual unit. So they're actually developing for a big group of unknown individuals. There is no single client. That means that there's a disconnect between the people who are producing the apartments and the people who are consuming them. That includes the people who are buying them and the people who are then going to live in them, which is another level of disconnect if they're rented. The speculative strata development model also relies on pre-sale for finance, and pre-sales are more likely to investor owners, and therefore there's a preference to develop for investor owners. And if there's an assumption that investor owners are less interested in sustainability, that becomes a problem. Another problem, another disconnect between production and consumption is the developer is not the end user or the manager of the building. So the person who's making the decisions about design and construction is not the person who's going to be responsible for holding the can when the design and the construction fail down the line, or where the costs of maintenance will exceed what they could have been if the building had been designed and constructed differently. It also means, this system means, for the individual owner who's buying an individual unit, it's quite difficult for them to get the information they need about what they're buying into. Even just something so simple as when you buy a house, you can commission someone to come and inspect the physical structure of the house and tell you how it is. If you're buying a unit in a building, it's very expensive to hire someone to come and inspect the physical structure of the entire strata building or complex for you, but that's actually what you're buying into when you buy. Hopefully you've followed that. It was a very quick intro to the strata. So here's just a couple of quotes which speak to this kind of issue. And in the first one, I'll just say CapEx is capital expenditure. I know. Okay. So another difference with apartments is that they're interrelated and jointly owned. That has relevance to circular economy principles in a positive way, in the sense that there is the potential for sharing. So there's the potential for making the most of the fact that things are shared in buildings. One really important way that happens is all the units are interrelated, and that can have benefits for energy efficiency. So I've got an arrow to a box here, and this box is a description in the report. I'm relying on the box because it was written by the wonderful Gloria Pignata, who is the expert in this space, and I'm not. But what's really interesting about this is that while apartments should be performing better in terms of energy efficiency because they've got shared walls and floors and ceilings, which means there's less external space for loss of energy, they're not, because the most common apartment floor plans are single aspect apartments, which are accessed from a central corridor, because that maximizes saleable area and therefore profit. So in single access apartments, you can't do cross ventilation well, and a lot of the apartments are poorly orientated in terms of solar access. So the fact that they're interrelated and jointly owned also means that facilities management and maintenance is often under-resourced. There's a lot of published evidence of the difficulties of properly resourcing and maintaining strata buildings under joint ownership. And also most plant and equipment and structural components are common property, which means that they're jointly owned and managed by multiple owners. And residents are often unaware of shared energy and water use, so they're not sure what's actually happening. They're not necessarily paying attention to those bills. And also government schemes and subsidies are targeted at households and often aren't fit for purpose for apartments because they don't take into consideration common property ownership. They talk about the household or the property ownership as in the individual lot ownership. So then we've got joint decision making, which is relevant to circular economy principles because of the potential to prolong product life through maintenance, which is often not realised. Okay, so now let's get to the guts of the presentation. Why don't we have a mainstream supply of sustainable apartments and what needs to change? So we're here in this challenge part of the table. These are the challenges. Sustainability is not embedded in project feasibility. Changes are made during construction to reduce costs. Sustainable building performance is not adequately reflected in property valuation. Potential benefits of interdependence are lost due to a focus on profit maximisation. Potential benefits of shared services face the challenge of shared management. Limited information on building performance is available to purchasers or renters, and joint decision making is required for jointly owned property. Okay. So these are the headings from before: speculative strata type development, and these are the three concerns that fall under that heading. In terms of physically interdependent properties, these are the concerns. This quote from the retrofit consultant is talking to that lost potential. You know, really, we should be able to do better in apartments than we're doing in houses. It should be easier, but it's not. And these are some of the concerns relating to joint ownership. Okay, so what needs to happen instead? What are we trying to achieve and what are our recommendations trying to achieve in this research. So what we've done is we've got recommendations under each of those things that we're trying to achieve. And I'm not going to expect you to read these. They're just to show you that these exist in the report in one way, but I'll present them to you in a different way now. So across the broader inquiry, we set up a circular economy strategy framework, or another way of organising our recommendations into groups. So we organised our recommendations into 4 types of groups: reappraising value, which is about what are our values, what's driving us; tilting investment flows, which is about using financial levers and mechanisms; building capacity through skills and knowledge and training; and also shaping market practices and processes through regulations, performance drivers, and other mechanisms. And again, please refer to the report for this detail, but this is another way of presenting our recommendations across the report in these 4 areas. And we classified these as core opportunities, which are major things that need to happen, but that might not happen until some of those enduring interventions and specific actions have happened. So now I'm going to take you through the recommendations as they sit within those 4 parts of the recommendation triangle, square. So the first one, reappraising value. So our first recommendation, just a little one for us all: whole of government, circular economy and sustainability commitment. This was one that a lot of our participants kept coming back to. They said we need a clear guide from the top, and it needs to be from all levels of government. We need some surety around what the goal is, so that we also will have some surety around what some of the regulations and incentives and market mechanisms might be down the line. And I'll talk a little bit more about how developers in particular are talking about regulation and how that could best be implemented. Okay. Second one, shaping market practices and processes. We have a bunch in here. So increasing minimum standards in the National Construction Code, expanding the scope of the code, requiring high sustainable performance standards in DA assessments, strengthening regulations for pre and post occupancy compliance auditing, and implementing programs to standardise tools, measures and regulations for building performance, so that we're all speaking a common language of regulation. Give you a few moments to read these quotes, and then I'll talk a little bit about them as well. So I think what these quotes, and I put them in this order deliberately because I think they're quite interesting. So the first one is saying we need to increase minimum standards. That's the only way we're going to bring costs down, or that's the way we're going to bring costs down. It's basically saying if you have these things that are optional, then the people who don't do them are going to have a financial advantage. If everyone has to do them, we're going to find a way to make them cheaper to do. Tongue in cheek, maybe based on experience, that's what we're good at doing in this country, right? We're good at doing the minimum at the cheapest cost. So what we need to do is increase the minimum so everyone's doing that, and then it will become cheaper to do it. The second quote is really just an example of where that has happened in New South Wales. So this is a developer thinking back to the introduction of the apartment design guide, SEP 65 in New South Wales, and saying essentially that's what happened. SEP 65 came in, it increased costs, the market adapted. The third one is a developer who's saying, yes, maybe this needs to happen, but we need to have it happen in stages. Can't just be brought upon us straight away, because we will have already bought land on the assumption that particular regulations are in place. If you then change the regulations, we don't know where there's money. So there's going to need to be somewhere in between. Regulations will need to be brought in, but there also needs to be some surety around the fact that they're going to stick, that they're not going to be negotiable, that they're going to be brought in at timeframes that are going to be adhered to, because all of those things are going to influence what developers actually pay for land that they're then going to develop apartments in. So then the third of our 4 areas, tilting investment flows. You saw the quote before from the valuer saying we're just comparing apples with apples. Essentially, we don't give properties that have high sustainability performance or higher value in our valuation practices. That's really problematic from a market perspective, because that means that both consumers don't know what they're buying, but also there's no market lever to improve performance. So there needs to be work done to ensure that these things are incorporated into valuation practice. We're also suggesting that the Australian government look at European Union's obligations on financiers for leveraging private financing. And it's quite interesting, actually, the quote at the bottom there from the builder is saying that he's noticed that some financiers are already doing that, independent of those types of regulations. Okay. And then the final of the 4 groups, building capacity. Some people complained about DA applications and planners not really understanding what they were looking at when they were reviewing applications that went outside of the norm, that were trying to incorporate sustainability features that perhaps they hadn't seen before. So one of our recommendations is we need to ensure that planning assessment system is adequately resourced to be able to assess those types of things, that we can't just say planners need to do better. We also, or those assessing DA applications need to do better. We also need to make sure that they have the capacity to do that work. We're also suggesting an online portal to enable knowledge exchange. This was something that was brought up again and again. There is information out there, but there isn't really any sensible places to be sharing it. So we also talked about retrofits in the report. I haven't talked about them much here, but I'm going to talk about them just briefly. And the challenges associated with retrofits around those 3 things that are unique about apartments, and also some recommendations for improving the situation when it comes to retrofits. So we're suggesting that consideration be given to legislative and regulatory amendments to encourage and support retrofit, and we refer to those amendments that have already occurred or in train at the moment in Australia. And we also suggest that there should be a mandate for the collection of environmental performance for all buildings. So I think this first quote here from a financier is quite interesting. They're saying, in the bank where they work, they're providing additional loan to value ratios and pricing discounts for clients that have solar panels. And then they go on to say, oh, but not for apartments. So these are available to people in houses, they're not available to people in apartments. Because that information is not measured to be able to allow them to provide individual household benefits. And then the second quote there is that recommendation that we need to have mandated ratings and reporting systems so that people can actually know how a building is performing before they decide to move into it or to buy it. So the retrofits recommendations did not fit on one page. This is the rest of them. Ensuring common property is considered in government grants, and often it's not. Introducing additional government grants to incentivise housing retrofit programs. The reason we suggested that was not because the grants themselves are necessarily required to make it stack up financially, but what we found from talking to people was that the fact that grants exist is enough to get people talking about doing something in their building, and the fact that they're going to get something for free is enough to push people over the line to agree to do it, even if the actual financial amount is not sufficient. So even small grants are enough to educate and push people to act now rather than not act, which I thought was a really interesting finding. We're also suggesting information repositories, and this is a really important one, I think, R16. Updating apartment design guidelines to ensure that the potential for future retrofit is considered before new apartment projects are approved. What we're seeing a lot now is, and what people told us that we interviewed, is that the new buildings that are being delivered now are not as easily retrofitted as buildings we were delivering 20 or 30 years ago. And so the problems that we're having now are going to be much worse in 20 or 30 years from now. And it's not okay that that's not being considered in the design guidance for new builds. We also talk in the report about, I've talked a lot about the strata system and the speculative strata market and the challenges that raises. We also talk about alternatives to that system in the report and what the potential might be around those. And we have a few recommendations there too. So the big case for build to rent here is that potentially, because build to rent operators, because it's a single client and because that client is interested in the ongoing running costs and maintenance of that property, you might be more likely to see a good outcome. I didn't put all the quotes on here because they didn't fit, but some of the other people we spoke to said, sure, but actually a lot of the build to rent that's out there is just speculative strata product that's being held until the market improves. So they were saying build to rent in itself is not necessarily going to improve this thing, but build to rent that is built as purpose-built rental for the purposes of ongoing ownership and management may improve these types of issues. And then we've also got a recommendation there around taxation, just to make sure that housing taxation systems are not prioritising some types of development over others, and we know that they are. The example that I've got there is around resident participation in development. So this is deliberative development where owners come together and organise to have a building built together. There are tax reasons why that's not particularly attractive currently. All right, so that brings me to the end of the entire report. I'm going to finish with this slide and then the references slide and then a link to the report. But I wanted to come back to this slide because I feel like I was overwhelmed preparing this presentation because there was just so much stuff. I imagine that you're overwhelmed having had me tell it all to you really quickly without all of the detail behind it. But I just wanted to come back to this because I think this is the crux of it. On the left, these are the reasons why apartments are different. This is why it matters in terms of circular economy principles. These are the challenges that raises, and therefore this is what we need to achieve. And the recommendations are trying to help us to achieve that. There's probably more needed than what we came up with in the report in terms of recommendations, but it's a pretty good start, I think. So here are the references. Happy to share these if anyone wants them. Realize, or you can take a screenshot if you're online. There's some good papers in there. All right, and that's a wrap.
Great. So we have that was perfectly timed. We've got 20 minutes for Q&A. Let's stop sharing that. Looks like we've got a couple questions or hands up online.
Can I just say, just before the questions start, if any of my co-authors are online, and I think some of you might be, please feel free to chip in answering the questions.
Hazel, I guess one of the things I'm interested in from your talk is whether there's been any looking at what happens with public housing authorities like Land and Housing Corporation and the interaction with developers, and whether or not these sort of principles that you're identifying are actually flowing through to those sort of developments, or whether it's really conventional building practice without taking into account the sustainability aspects.
That's an excellent question, Jeff. I don't know, because we didn't look at that in this report, and I don't know because I haven't spoken with people about it otherwise. You might have a look at some of the other sub-reports under the inquiry, which do look at social housing as well, and possibly contact Ralph Horn, who led the inquiry project, to see if he can direct you to the answer to that question. But sorry, I'm not sure. Just anyone in the room or online have an answer to Jeff's question? Sorry, Jeff. We had to contain it somehow, and we contained it by focusing on the strata title apartment delivery for private ownership.
Sure, surely, Jeff. A lot of what you're talking about, particularly, well, obviously Waterloo, is going to be delivered by the private sector. So what Hazel's recommendations would apply to that, because most renewal of public housing now is passed over to the private sector to deliver. So it would catch those sort of situations as well, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, maybe I misunderstood the question. So
Maybe I
yeah.
understood.
So certainly the things that we're recommending, I think, will flow through to improve the situation outside of the private apartment sector. I think they'll flow through to improve the situation for all types of development, including detached house development in many cases. So yeah, and a lot of the larger developers do quite a bit of private apartment development, and if they're improving or changing their practices and approaches, then you'll see that flow through to all of their developments. So hopefully, yes, but I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking. Do you want to ask again?
Yeah, so I guess my concern is to, if an organisation like Land and Housing Corporation in New South Wales doesn't build in these sort of requirements, then when it actually comes to developers bidding on projects, they're likely to build what they're building anyhow, but with a bit better quality for the maintenance side of stuff, but not necessarily taking into account things like cross ventilation and other things that are important in terms of livability. And that's just the area that I'm sort of just a bit interested in, as to whether or not there's been any sort of, or there's potential for follow-up work to see how that's being delivered with them as a major build-to-rent operator, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's super important. And the other thing I would add to that is I think that the contracting is going to be really important in that space. So, you know, the contracting is going to need to be quite specific about what is expected in terms of outcomes so that you don't get to a situation where developers are able to cut costs and cut sustainability features down the line because the contracts allow them to do that.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I don't think that's usually a requirement. When it comes to kind of special dispensation, they usually focus on particular population groups. So for an aging population, for example, there are some design elements that they will require, but in terms of sustainability, it's often not the case. The only one that I'm aware of is if the finance is arranged through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, where they impose, you know, minimum star standard. And sometimes developers do meet and exceed that, but it's quite rare.
Can I chip in again? Sorry, Jeff. Can you see people who are talking? Okay. Well, that was Edgar over the other side of it. Bill Randolph here. You'll recall the stimulus package development in New South Wales. Well, I understand, if I remember back that far, environmental sustainability was part of the contracts that were set out. And I can remember distinctly some very sort of sustainable developments being part of the stimulus package as it was being rolled out. So there's no reason why Land and Housing Corporation shouldn't do exactly the same thing from here on with its estates renewal contracts. You know, Housing New South Wales used to do it. Homes New South Wales, as it will be called, should also be expected to do it. And I think there's a real case to press the New South Wales Housing Minister, sorry, making this very New South Wales orientated, to press the New South Wales Housing Minister to look back at that example, that experience, and ensure that the contracts for estates renewal have the same outcomes.
Thanks, Bill.
There's somebody else online.
Go ahead. We'll go back and forth.
Go back and forth. Thank you, Hazel. That was great. I'm wondering of that kind of very extensive list of recommendations, which you would prioritise, if any, or if they're all kind of equal value, or if they're all kind of the same. Because one of the things that strikes me, sorry, I'm Kylie for those of you who can't see, hope you can hear. One of the things that strikes me as a kind of obstacle to this is what is in the way often, which is that sustainability is presented as a kind of trade-off between something that's sustainable but costs more and something that's not sustainable but costs less. And it strikes me that as long as we have a definition of sustainable that has that trade-off built in, developers are always going to come back with that same argument that they come back to every single friggin' possible thing, which is that we would love to, but we can't get the finance and the market won't do it. So it does seem to me that some of your recommendations kind of continue that sort of logic or collude with that kind of logic, and some of them, such as you just shouldn't be able to value something without including this as a cost thing, actually work against it. So is that something that I'm just inventing, or does that
We've provided recommendations that you might call kind of how to put it. We've provided carrot and stick recommendations deliberately, and they need to be delivered as a package. So to answer your question, I'm not sure if the other authors would necessarily agree, but I think that the two most important regulations are improving minimum standards. I think that's important not only because we need to have better minimum standards, but because it will lead to efficiencies around just delivering better buildings more efficiently, as those quotes go. The other one that I think is really important is having mandatory reporting of the performance of buildings on rental and purchasing sites. So domain, realestate.com, etc., which is more of a carrot But mandatory reporting means that purchasers or renters can choose if they have the ability to, or at least they can go into their choices with eyes open about how their buildings and their units are performing. So I think they're the most important ones. But I do think that we need a combination of carrot and stick at the same time, because the stick is going to bring up the minimum, the carrot is going to push the envelope.
Yeah.
Right. So we need both.
Can I stretch the friendship and ask a sort of follow-up thing, which is that, I mean, and you know, obviously I have no idea what I'm talking about, and I do defer to the expertise in the room. On the plus side, I am bringing the content of girls in the room up.
That's for those of you who know.
It does strike me also that one of those factors about the trade-off between sustainability and profit to this point, and sort of continues in the real estate pages, is that for people who have a lot of money, sustainability is increasingly being put forward as something that's beautiful, that is something that you would want and something that makes your place better. And when it comes to social housing, sustainability is always termed in things like utility bills and performance of the building, and whether, you know, where the doors are, and if it's actually going to fall down when it gets hot. So would it be possible also to do some work in dismantling that kind of binary as well, that sustainability is gorgeous but expensive, or it's ugly but it brings your electricity bill down? Because if that continues, then we're going to stay in the same sort of pickle as well, I think.
The good news is that some of that work is done by some of our participants in the report. So there are some discussions in the report around whether more sustainable building practices are necessarily more expensive and where they don't need to be. And there's also some discussion in the report about where people who are buying into high-end properties are not really getting their money's worth. So, you know, then it's the kind of greenwashing status sustainability stuff. So there's certainly hints of that already in the comments that participants said. But yeah, I think unpacking that discourse and challenging it head on would be a really nice next step. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll switch to somebody online.
Oh, I was going to ask something. So
Nobody online.
No one's online.
Okay.
It's Jasmine Palmer here. Could I respond to the previous question?
Yes, please, Jasmine.
To the question of, you know, the different types of recommendations, and some of them being, you know, modifying the existing and not really challenging the conceptualization of value and what sustainability means. I think through the report we have recommendations that sit at both ends. Recommendations that are about what can we do right now within the existing structures and frameworks that exist, and recommendations that might be aiming to achieve more in the future. So some being very practical and on the ground right now, let's increase the minimum standards, but let's also think about what we understand value to be as a bigger picture idea. So I think we do cover that sort of range of things, but the question of which one comes first or which is most important, I think is pretty challenging. And in the report, we identify that not all of the responsibilities sit with the same levels of government or the same levels of, or have the same capacity to be controlled by different actors within the systems. So, you know, some things are at the responsibility of at a Commonwealth level, some at state, some at local, some by the industry themselves. So some of the diagrams in there look at, well, who does the responsibility sit with? And importantly, looks at, well, which actions need to be taken before others. So I think we haven't tried to prioritise which is going to have the best measurable outcome, but which ones can we start with and where it might lead to in the long run. So I think it's kind of got that stepwise nature to it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Well, we do have a comment now. Tonya Gibson's mentioned mandatory reporting of performance standards is likely to make it much easier to get these across the line for retrofits and strata. Other good examples of this overseas you'd recommend we adopt here?
Thanks, Tonya. And hi, I'm glad you're here. Tonya does a lot of consulting with strata buildings on these types of projects. So You know your stuff. Jasmine, are you able to help on the examples from overseas part of that question?
Oh, Jasmine's still muted.
I apologise. I only half heard the question, Tonya. Sorry about that.
So the question was, well, the question was in support of mandatory reporting, but then are there examples of mandatory reporting of performance standards overseas?
Oh, there are a few jurisdictions that require it. I think the one we can, look at is Canberra, where it's mandatory to report the performance of dwellings at the point of sale. So that's sort of the most nearby example. Overseas, there are a few, but most of them are voluntary. And there isn't much reporting to indicate what the flow-on effect of that is just yet in terms of understanding of value. So unfortunately, nothing to go directly to at this point.
That's Phil, do you want to add?
So the UK has it. Yeah, if you want to look at Zoopla or whatever, you'll see the rating for each property.
Did you catch that, Tonya? Have a look in the UK as well.
Hazel, on the valuation side of things, you picked up the valuer not valuing it, which sort of links into the banks, as you know, the banks call for valuation and they want to get the sustainability measures, then they will just tell the valuer to do that. Mm-hmm. And you interviewed someone at least from the banking sector, and they were talking about, wanting that sort of information for detached dwellings. Yeah. But you said that they don't want it for apartments, or it's too difficult.
They can't get it for apartments. So they're offering incentives to owners of detached dwellings for having sustainable homes, but they can't get the information about the performance of the individual units in the apartments. They can't get reliable information to be able to offer those products to the unit owners.
Right. Hazel, regarding retrofitting, you mentioned that older buildings are more easy to retrofit than newer ones. I presume despite SEP 65 in New South Wales. Why is that?
So it was a generalisation. So not necessarily all older buildings and all newer buildings. So part of it's because in the newer buildings they are built to their absolute maximum capacity. So they're built out as far as they can be built. There's no extra land anywhere. They can't necessarily take more weight. So older buildings might be able to take new units on the roof or new balconies on the outside of a building, but the new buildings can't because they're engineered to meet the minimum standards and not necessarily exceed them. So there's no spare anything. There's no spare land. There's no spare ability to take weight. There's no spare electrical capacity, which is a problem for EV charging at the moment. So those are the types of things. It's also about what they're constructed out of. A lot of the older buildings are brick and the newer ones are concrete and steel.
Yeah, I would have thought in some ways being framed concrete and steel buildings, they might be a bit easier to modify than load-bearing brickwork ones of the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, well, hopefully. I'm proved wrong.
No, I'm sure.
But there's also the quality issue. Are the buildings that are being built now being built so that they will be in a position to be retrofitted or upgraded in 40 or 50 years from now?
Yeah.
Or is the expectation that they'll be knocked down and rebuilt?
Yeah, so a couple of comments. We've got Nikki Hodgson, who's very kindly posted a link in the chat for the UK's energy performance certificates. And Tonya Gibson, who's mentioned that no mandatory neighbours ratings for apartment buildings. However, there is commercial properties. But I'd also just like to ask, is there non-regulatory things they can do, like allowing private use of common areas for solar cells and things like that? But they're also non-regulatory sort of things, or is it mostly regulations?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of opportunities for upgrading apartment buildings currently to improve sustainability performance, and lots of buildings, for example, have upgraded their lighting systems, which they've been able to get some subsidy for, but also it's a really good low-hanging fruit to reduce your electricity usage. And buildings are doing all sorts of really exciting things. A great program to have a look at if you're interested in that is the City of Sydney's Smart Green Apartments program. So that's a program where the local government works with buildings that have applied to be part of the program to do an assessment on their building performance and then to do sustainability upgrades across the building. So that's open for buildings with more than 70 units in the City of Sydney. And they've had lots of buildings go through that program. We talk about that program in the report as well, as a good case.
We're right at 5 o'clock, so maybe we'll wrap up then. And thanks again, Hazel.
Questions, and thanks especially Jasmine for answering some of them with me. Appreciate it.
Great. And if you're not familiar, the seminar series runs about every 2 weeks during the school term. So keep your eye out for the next seminar coming up in a couple of weeks. Thanks again.